The sound of violins filled the air, followed by the deep hum of cellos. Inside the city's grand concert hall, rehearsals were in full swing. Musicians were tuning their instruments, chatting softly, and adjusting their seats under the bright stage lights. The upcoming concert was an important one, and the conductor wanted everything to be perfect. At the far corner of the stage, a young man in a simple gray uniform moved quietly with a mop and bucket. He was one of the cleaning staff, assigned to keep the stage spotless before and after every rehearsal. He worked silently, careful not to get in anyone's way. Most people barely noticed him. To them, he was just the cleaner, someone invisible in the background. He didn't mind much. Cleaning gave him peace. But today, something kept pulling his eyes toward the grand piano that sat in the center of the stage. It wasn't just any piano. It was a glossy black Steinway shining under the lights like a jewel. Every time a musician passed it, they treated it like a sacred object. Even the way the conductor spoke about it made it sound like something holy. As he mopped near it, the young man slowed down. He couldn't resist taking a closer look. His reflection stared back at him from the smooth black surface. His hands were rough from years of work, but his fingers twitched slightly, as if remembering something they hadn't done in a long time. He looked around. The conductor was talking to the violinists, his voice echoing through the hall. The rest of the orchestra seemed busy. Maybe just one touch, he thought. Just one. He placed his mop aside and took a small step forward. His fingertips brushed the keys, cold and smooth. He pressed one softly. A faint note echoed, delicate and pure. It sent a small shiver through him. Without realizing, he pressed another key, then another. A melody began to form, quiet and fragile like a memory coming back to life. For a few seconds, he forgot where he was. The music pulled him somewhere else, to a place long buried in his heart. But before he could play another note, a sharp voice thundered through the hall. "Don't touch my piano, poor guy." The words sliced through the air. Everyone stopped. The musicians turned. The conductor stood near the podium, glaring at him with cold fury. The young man froze, his hands still hovering over the keys. I'm sorry," he stammered, stepping back quickly. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to?" The conductor interrupted, his tone dripping with contempt. "That piano costs more than your entire salary for the year. Do your job and stay away from things you don't understand." A few musicians chuckled under their breath. Some whispered to each other. The young man's face turned red. He mumbled an apology again, grabbed his mop and backed away. The laughter lingered for a moment before everyone went back to their work, as if nothing had happened. But inside him something cracked. Not out of anger, out of longing. He went back to cleaning, but his mind wasn't in it anymore. Every sound of the piano during rehearsal made his chest tighten. The conductor barked orders, musicians played their notes. But he heard something else. The kind of music that used to fill his home years ago. When the rehearsal ended and the musicians began packing up, he worked faster than usual. He mopped the stage, wiped the instrument stands, and quietly gathered the trash. As the conductor left, he gave him a cold look. One that said, "Remember your place." The young man nodded silently, but that night, after everyone was gone and the lights were dimmed, he found himself unable to leave. The echo of music still hung in the air. The hall was empty now, silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. He stood near the piano again, his heart racing. He knew he shouldn't, but the temptation was too strong. He looked at the heavy doors, making sure they were closed. Then he sat down. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. And then, slowly, he began to play. At first, the sound was soft, hesitant, almost shy. But within seconds, it grew stronger. His fingers moved faster, gracefully, like they had done this 1,000 times before. The melody that filled the hall was not one of practice or performance. It was emotion, raw and alive. Each note told a story. Each chord carried a piece of his heart. He played with his eyes closed, lost in the rhythm. He wasn't cleaning anymore. He wasn't the poor guy everyone ignored. In that moment, he was free. A musician, an artist, a soul speaking through sound. Unbeknownst to him, a security guard making his rounds stopped by the door. He was used to hearing silence after hours, but tonight, something stopped him in his tracks. The music was so hauntingly beautiful that he stood still, holding his flashlight, afraid to move. He peeked through the small window in the door and saw the cleaner playing the grand piano like he was born for it. The guard couldn't believe his eyes. He pulled out his phone quietly and hit record. He didn't mean to invade privacy. He just felt the world should see this moment. The man on stage wasn't just playing notes. He was pouring his heart into every sound. The melody rose higher, the notes flowing like waves crashing gently on the shore. For minutes, the guard forgot about time, lost in the music. It was the kind of performance that made you feel everything. Sadness, hope, loss, beauty all at once. Finally, the music slowed. The last note lingered in the air, trembling softly before fading into silence. The cleaner stayed still, his hands resting on the keys. His eyes were wet, though he didn't realize it. For him, the music wasn't about showing off. It was a way to remember. His late mother, who once taught him how to play on a broken keyboard when he was a child. She used to tell him, "Music isn't about perfection, it's about honesty." And tonight he had played with all the honesty he had left. He stood up quietly, wiped his face, and picked up his mop again. The hall was still and peaceful now. He whispered softly, "Sorry, I just missed it." Then he walked out, locking the door behind him, not knowing that someone had just captured the moment that would change his life forever. The next morning he came to work as usual. The orchestra was back, rehearsing for the big event. The conductor was as strict as always, snapping at players, demanding precision. Nobody mentioned last night because nobody knew. He worked quietly, as he always did, sweeping the floor, collecting discarded sheet music, staying in the background. But somewhere else in the city, a video was making its way across social media. The clip, titled, "Unknown Cleaner Plays Like a Maestro in Empty Concert Hall," started gaining views fast. People shared it, calling it soulful, unreal, pure genius. Within hours, it spread to music forums, pages, and even news outlets. The comment sections were full of awe. Who is he? Where does he work? This is the most moving thing I've ever heard. Back in the concert hall, life carried on normally. The cleaner had no idea that thousands of people were already talking about him online. He still felt small, invisible, like someone who belonged behind the curtains, not under the spotlight. But destiny, quietly and patiently, had already started moving in his favor. As the day went on, one of the younger violinists scrolled through her phone during a break. She stumbled upon the video and gasped. "Wait," she whispered, eyes widening. "That's our hall." She showed it to a fellow musician. They both leaned in closer, watching the shadowed figure playing in the familiar stage light. The sound was unmistakable. The camera was too far to show his face clearly, but the gray uniform and the way he sat told them everything. Within minutes, whispers began to spread around the orchestra. By the time rehearsal ended, almost everyone had seen the video. Some were amazed. Others felt guilty. The same man they had laughed at for touching the piano had played it more beautifully than any of them ever could. Meanwhile, the conductor saw the video too after a friend sent it to him with the message, "You should hear this. A real prodigy." He watched it for a few seconds and scoffed. "Another internet trick," he muttered, turning it off. He didn't realize that the performance he had just dismissed was recorded right under his own nose, on his own piano, by the same man he'd humiliated the day before. And so, without knowing it, the cleaner's quiet act of courage had started a storm that would soon change everything, not just for him but for everyone who once doubted that greatness can come from the humblest of hearts. The next morning came quietly, with soft sunlight touching the windows of the concert hall. The cleaner walked in early, as he always did. His job was simple: sweep the floors, dust the seats, clean the stage. But that morning, something in the air felt different. Maybe it was the leftover music from last night's rehearsal, or maybe it was the grand piano sitting in the middle of the stage, shining under the dim lights. He stopped for a moment and looked at it. The piano was beautiful, black and polished, its surface reflecting the empty hall like a mirror. Every time he saw it, his heart ached a little. It reminded him of something he'd left behind long ago, something that had once made him feel alive. He took a deep breath and went back to work. The hall was quiet except for the sound of his broom brushing across the wooden floor. He worked carefully, never letting dust touch the piano. It wasn't part of his job to clean it, but he couldn't help it. He wiped it gently with a soft cloth as if afraid to wake it. As he stood there, he couldn't resist pressing one key, Just one. The soft sound filled the air, clear and pure. He froze, listening as the note faded. Then he pressed another key and another. Before he knew it, his hands had begun to move on their own. The melody that came out wasn't planned. It came from somewhere deep inside him, soft, emotional, full of longing. Each note seemed to tell a story he couldn't put into words. He closed his eyes and let his fingers speak for him. He didn't notice the man standing at the doorway. The conductor had come in early that morning, too, planning to review some scores before rehearsal. When he heard the music, he stopped in his tracks. For a moment, he thought it was a recording. The sound was too rich, too full of feeling to come from a random cleaner. But when he saw the young man sitting at the piano, his eyes closed, playing like his heart was pouring out through his hands, the conductor's face turned hard. "Hey," his voice echoed sharply across the hall. The cleaner jumped in shock, his hands freezing over the keys. "What do you think you're doing?" the conductor snapped, walking quickly toward the stage. "Did anyone give you permission to touch that piano?" The cleaner stood up immediately, his face pale. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to. Don't you understand this instrument costs more than your entire year's salary?" the conductor said, his voice rising. "Who told you you could play it?" "I'm sorry," the cleaner said softly, lowering his head. "I was just cleaning it." "Cleaning it?" The conductor's anger grew. "Do you think this is a toy? This piano is for professionals, not for janitors who don't know their place." The cleaner swallowed hard. He wanted to explain that he did know how to play, that music wasn't foreign to him, but his throat tightened. He just nodded and stepped back. "Stay away from that instrument," the conductor said coldly. "If I catch you touching it again, you'll lose your job. Understand?" The cleaner nodded silently, his chest heavy. The conductor turned away, muttering under his breath about irresponsible staff as he walked off. For the rest of the morning, the cleaner worked quietly, keeping his eyes down. He felt like a fool. Why had he touched it? He knew better. That piano wasn't meant for someone like him. Still, the memory of the sound lingered. The way the notes had flowed felt too real to forget. He tried to shake it off, but his heart wouldn't let go. Later that day, the musicians began arriving for rehearsal. They laughed, chatted, and tuned their instruments as the conductor gave orders. The cleaner stayed in the corner, sweeping slowly. He could hear them playing, the violins, the cellos, the horns, but something about the sound felt stiff. It was beautiful, yes, but it didn't have life in it. As the rehearsal went on, one of the pianists, a guest artist, arrived. He was elegant, confident, and clearly proud of his skill. The conductor greeted him warmly. "We've been waiting for you," he said. "The orchestra will follow your lead during the solo section." The pianist nodded, adjusting his jacket. He sat down at the grand piano and began to play. The notes were fast, sharp, technically perfect. The musicians followed, the conductor guiding them carefully. But after a few minutes, something went wrong. The pianist suddenly stopped and frowned. "The tuning feels off," he said. The conductor checked the sheet and shook his head. "No, the instrument was tuned this morning." The pianist sighed, clearly irritated. "It's not responding right. Maybe it's the hall acoustics." They tried again, but the performance still lacked something. The conductor frowned. The sound was right, but it felt empty, as if something invisible was missing. The cleaner listened quietly from the back. He wanted to say something, but he stayed silent. What could he possibly say that these trained musicians would listen to? After a long hour of struggle, the pianist grew frustrated. "I need a break," he said, standing up and walking off the stage. The conductor agreed, rubbing his temples. "Everyone, take 15 minutes," he said. As the hall emptied, the cleaner continued his work. He moved toward the stage, his broom scraping gently against the floor. His eyes fell again on the piano. It looked almost sad now, left alone, still and silent. He looked around. No one was there. His heart pounded. "Just one note," he whispered to himself. He sat down again, hands trembling slightly. The moment his fingers touched the keys, it was like breathing again after holding his breath too long. He began to play softly, not to show off, not to be heard, but simply because he missed it. The melody filled the hall, tender and beautiful. It was the same tune he had played that morning, only now deeper, fuller, filled with emotion. His fingers moved effortlessly, his eyes closed. He wasn't thinking, he was feeling. And then behind him a quiet voice said, "Keep going." He froze. His heart stopped for a second. Slowly he turned his head. The conductor was standing at the door again, but this time his face wasn't angry. It was unreadable, curious, almost stunned. "Play," the conductor said softly. "Don't stop," the cleaner hesitated. "Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "I said play," the conductor repeated firmly, though his voice was calm. The cleaner took a shaky breath and turned back to the piano. He placed his fingers on the keys again and began to play. This time the conductor didn't interrupt. He stood still, watching. The melody rose and fell like waves, smooth and emotional. The cleaner played as if the piano was an extension of himself. His body swayed slightly, his eyes shut, every note filled with heart. When he finished, silence hung in the air. The conductor walked slowly toward him. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked quietly. The cleaner didn't look up. "At home, sir," he said. "My mother taught me when I was a child. We had an old piano. It barely worked, but she loved it. After she passed, I couldn't play anymore." The conductor didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "That piece you played, did you compose it yourself?" The cleaner nodded. I just made it up one day. It's not finished." The conductor's eyes softened. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. The cleaner blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The conductor sighed deeply. "I shouldn't have shouted at you earlier. I was wrong." The young man didn't know what to say. He just stared at the piano, his fingers still resting on the keys. "Come tomorrow," the conductor said after a pause. "Before rehearsal. I want to hear more." The cleaner looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Sir?" "You heard me," the conductor said, his tone gentle but firm. "Don't be late." Then he turned and walked out, leaving the cleaner speechless. That night, the cleaner went home and sat by his window for a long time. The city lights flickered outside. His mind replayed the moment. The conductor's face, his words, the sound of the piano. He didn't know what this meant or where it would lead. But for the first time in years, he felt a small spark of hope flicker inside him. He whispered to himself, Maybe this isn't the end. Maybe it's the beginning." And somewhere deep down he knew his life was about to change forever. By the next morning, the video had already spread farther than anyone could imagine. The short clip of the cleaner playing the grand piano had captured thousands of hearts overnight. People from around the world shared it, calling him a hidden genius. Some said they cried listening to it. Others said it was the most honest piece of music they had ever heard. In the concert hall, though, life went on as usual. The cleaner didn't have a phone good enough to see the video or even know it existed. He woke up early, caught the same bus, and walked into the same hall with his mop and bucket. He had no idea that outside those walls, people were already searching for him. The orchestra was busy rehearsing. The conductor, known for his sharp temper and cold eyes, was in the middle of correcting a cellist. He hadn't seen the cleaner come in, nor did he notice the whispers beginning among the musicians. A few of them had watched the viral video before the rehearsal started. They recognized the hall, the soft stage lights, and even the way the piano was placed. One violinist leaned toward another and whispered, "It's him, isn't it? It has to be. That's the same uniform." They both glanced toward the cleaner sweeping quietly near the corner of the stage. He moved like he always did, careful, humble, invisible. But now when people looked at him, there was curiosity instead of mockery. During the break, a few musicians gathered in the hallway. They played the video on a phone, huddled together, the sound echoing softly in the corridor. "Listen to that part," one said, rewinding. "That's not just skill. That's emotion," someone else added, and to think we laughed at him. Just then the conductor walked in. "What are you all doing?" he demanded. The musicians quickly hid their phones. "Nothing, sir. Just a video," one mumbled. The conductor frowned. "If you have time for nonsense, then you have time to rehearse harder. Back to your places." As they returned, he glanced at the cleaner and muttered, "You, make sure the floor shines before the guests arrive tomorrow." The cleaner nodded politely. "Yes, sir." He didn't notice how several musicians kept looking at him differently now. He didn't notice how one of them was filming discreetly again, just in case they needed proof. He just worked quietly, unaware that he had already become famous beyond those walls. By noon, the video hit 1 million views. A local news outlet ran a headline, "Unknown cleaner plays piano like a professional virtuoso." The article said no one knew his name or where he worked. The only clue was the stage floor and the piano brand. Music lovers started guessing which hall it was. Some even tagged big conductors and orchestras, asking them to find this hidden musician. In another part of town, an old piano teacher watched the video. Tears filled his eyes. "This boy," he whispered to his wife. "Whoever he is, he plays with his soul." Back in the concert hall, the whispers turned into quiet discussions. During lunch break, a cellist approached the cleaner near the backstage area. "Hey," he said softly, "you play the piano, don't you?" The cleaner froze, his hand gripping the mop. "No, sir," he said quickly. "I just clean." The cellist smiled. "You don't have to lie." "I saw the video." The cleaner frowned. "What video?" The musician took out his phone and showed him. The cleaner stared at the screen, confused at first. Then his eyes widened. It was him sitting alone at the piano, lost in music. The camera had captured the way his fingers moved, the way his head tilted with each note. He felt his heart race. "Someone recorded me?" he whispered. "Yes," the cellist said gently. "And the whole world is talking about you." The cleaner didn't know what to say. He handed the phone back carefully. "I didn't mean for anyone to see. I was just playing." "That's the point," the musician said. "You weren't trying to impress anyone. That's why it's so powerful." Before he could reply, the conductor's voice echoed down the hallway. "Back to your places. Enough wasting time." The cellist nodded and left, leaving the cleaner standing there, still trying to process what he had seen. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat on his bed in the small room he rented, staring at the old photo of his mother on the wall. She had been a pianist in a small cafe years ago before illness took her away. She had taught him everything he knew, even when they had nothing. She used to say, "Music finds the ones who need it most." He whispered softly to her picture, "Maybe you were right, Mom." The next morning, the cleaner arrived earlier than usual. The hall was empty. He stood near the piano again, the same way he had before. He didn't touch it this time. He just looked at it, remembering how it felt to let go. He didn't know that in another room the conductor was on a phone call. "Yes, I saw the video," he said impatiently. "It's just another internet trick. People fake these things all the time. There's no proof it's even real." But deep down he couldn't shake a strange feeling. The sound in that video, the tone of the piano, the faint echo of the hall, felt familiar. Still, his pride wouldn't let him admit it. "I'll handle it," he said coldly, ending the call. Later that day, a few journalists showed up at the concert hall's entrance. They wanted to interview the orchestra about the mysterious pianist. The conductor was furious. "No one touches my hall for publicity," he snapped. "Throw them out." The musicians exchanged uneasy looks. The cleaner, hearing the noise from inside, stayed out of sight. He didn't want any trouble. But when one of the journalists walked past the glass door, she paused. "Wait," she said, pointing. "That's him." The conductor followed her gaze. There he was, the cleaner, standing awkwardly near the piano, head lowered. The journalists rushed forward, asking questions, cameras flashing. "Are you the man from the video? Can you play for us?" The cleaner stepped back nervously. "Please, I'm just here to work," he said softly. The conductor stepped in front of him, waving the cameras away. "Enough," he barked. "He's not a musician. He's just the cleaner. Leave him alone." The journalist tried to argue, but he refused to let them stay. Within minutes, the hall was cleared again. The cleaner looked down, embarrassed. "I didn't ask for this, sir," he said quietly. The conductor glared at him. "I don't care what you asked for. You embarrassed my orchestra. Don't touch that piano again." The cleaner nodded and walked away slowly, his heart heavy. He had never felt so small. But outside, the world continued to talk about him. Each minute, more people shared his story. Some called the hall, demanding they let him perform. Others created online petitions to find him. By evening, even national news channels mentioned him. The headline read, "Who is the poor cleaner who plays like a prodigy?" At the same time, in a cafe across town, a young music student watched the video and whispered to his friends, "This guy plays with more emotion than any of us at the academy." Another replied, "He doesn't play for fame. He plays because it's who he is." Back in the concert hall, the cleaner finished his shift quietly. He stayed a little longer, walking slowly around the empty stage. He didn't touch the piano again, but his reflection glimmered faintly in its surface. He wondered if maybe the world was finally hearing the voice he had kept hidden all these years. What he didn't know was that the next day, everything would change. The conductor, now under pressure from the public, would call him out, in front of everyone, demanding that he play again. The same man who had once shouted, "Don't touch my piano," would soon witness something no one in that hall would ever forget. The world had already seen his gift through a screen, but soon the world and those who had mocked him would hear it with their own ears. And this time there would be no stopping him. The next morning the hall felt tense. Something was different. The musicians whispered among themselves as they unpacked their instruments. The cleaner moved quietly in the background as he always did, avoiding attention. But today there was nowhere to hide. The conductor stood in the middle of the stage, arms folded, a cold expression on his face. He had finally realized that the viral video that had shaken the internet was filmed right here, in his own concert hall. He couldn't admit it out loud, but he knew that piano, that sound, that echo. Every detail matched. He couldn't understand how it had happened. How had a cleaner, someone he barely noticed, managed to play like that? And worse, how had the whole world found out before he did? His pride burned like fire. He felt mocked. When the cleaner entered with his mop and bucket, the conductor's sharp eyes followed him. The young man lowered his gaze and kept working, pretending not to notice. But the whispers around him grew louder. "That's him," someone whispered. "I still can't believe it. He's better than half the pianists I've met." The conductor suddenly raised his voice. "Everyone quiet." The musicians froze. The cleaner looked up, startled. The conductor turned toward him. "You," he said firmly. "Come here." The cleaner hesitated. His first instinct was to apologize. He thought he must have done something wrong again. Slowly he put the mop aside and walked to the stage. The conductor gestured toward the piano. "You seem to like this instrument a lot," he said mockingly. "You've touched it before. You've played it when no one asked you to. You even made my concert hall famous on the internet, didn't you?" The cleaner's hands trembled slightly. "Sir, I didn't mean to." "Stop talking," the conductor interrupted. His tone was calm but cutting. "If you really think you can play, then show us. Play right now, in front of everyone." A murmur went through the room. Some musicians exchanged uneasy glances. One of them whispered, "Sir, maybe that's not quiet." The conductor barked again. He turned back to the cleaner. "Go ahead. The piano is yours. Let's see if you can impress us as much as you impressed the internet." The cleaner's throat went dry. His heart pounded so loud he could barely think. He hadn't expected this. He didn't want attention. He only wanted to play because it made him feel alive. But now all eyes were on him, and not kindly. Some were curious, but others looked ready to laugh again. For a moment he wanted to walk away, but then he remembered the words his mother once said. "Music doesn't belong to the rich or the famous. It belongs to the heart that dares to feel." He took a slow breath and walked toward the piano. His hands shook as he lifted the cover over the keys. The black and white surface looked different now, brighter somehow. He sat down, feeling the silence around him press against his chest. He placed his fingers gently on the keys. The hall was so quiet he could hear his own breathing. And then, without saying a word, he began to play. The first notes were soft, trembling almost like a whisper. But then slowly the melody began to grow. His hands moved faster, steadier, stronger. The room filled with sound, deep, rich, and full of emotion. The conductor's face changed. The mocking smile faded. His eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected this. The music poured out like water from a spring, smooth, alive, unstoppable. The cleaner played with his eyes closed, completely lost in the music. He wasn't thinking about the people watching him. He wasn't thinking about fear or pride or humiliation. He was simply free. Every note carried a story of struggle, of loneliness, of hope. The melody rose and fell like waves, gentle and powerful at once. It filled every corner of the hall. The violinists who had been whispering minutes ago now sat frozen. A few of them blinked away tears. He played like someone who had lived 100 lives. Each note carried something raw and beautiful, something no training could teach. His hands glided over the keys with grace, his whole body moving with the rhythm as if the piano and his heart were one. When he reached the final section, the music changed. It became softer, almost like a prayer. His fingers slowed, trembling slightly before releasing the last fading chord. The sound lingered in the air, echoing faintly against the high ceiling. Then there was silence. For several long seconds, no one moved. The conductor stood still, his eyes locked on the young man who had just performed. The musicians seemed frozen in their seats. You could almost hear their hearts beating in the quiet. Then softly, someone started clapping. One person, then another, and another. Within moments, the entire room erupted into applause, loud, emotional, unstoppable. The cleaner looked up in shock. The same people who had once laughed at him were now standing, clapping, some even shouting, "Bravo!" and wiping tears from their eyes. He stood up slowly, unsure of what to do. The sound of clapping surrounded him, echoing off the walls. His eyes watered, not from pride, but from disbelief. For the first time in his life, people weren't looking down at him. They were looking up. The conductor finally stepped forward. The applause softened as he approached. He stopped a few feet away, looking at the cleaner quietly. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his voice, usually sharp, came out soft. "Who taught you?" he asked. The young man hesitated. "No one," he said quietly. "My mother used to play. I listened to her when I was little. That's all." The conductor blinked, stunned. "You mean you never studied?" He shook his head. "I wanted to, but life got hard after she passed away. I had to work. But I kept playing whenever I could." The conductor's expression softened in a way no one had seen before. His pride seemed to melt away. "You play with something I can't teach," he said slowly. "You play with truth." The cleaner didn't know how to respond. He just nodded and stepped back. The musicians continued clapping. Some even walked up to him, shaking his hand, thanking him for the music. When the applause finally faded, the conductor turned to the orchestra and said, "Take a break." Then quieter, he added, "All of you just witnessed something rare. Remember it." The musicians slowly left the stage, still whispering in amazement. The cleaner remained standing beside the piano, unsure what to do next. He felt both light and dizzy, like he'd been dreaming. As the hall emptied, the conductor came back to him. "Listen," he said, his tone different now, not as a boss, but as a man. "Tomorrow there's a rehearsal for the main performance. I want you to be here, not as a cleaner." The cleaner looked confused. "What do you mean, sir?" The conductor smiled faintly. "I want you to play." The young man stared at him, speechless. "But I'm not a professional." "You're more than that," the conductor said softly. "You have what most of us spend our lives chasing." The cleaner didn't know what to say. All he could do was nod slowly, his heart full. As he walked home that night, the city lights blurred through his tears. The same hands that once carried a mop now carried something greater, hope. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Mom, they finally heard me." The next day would bring even more surprises, reporters, cameras, and crowds. But for now, that moment on stage, the moment when silence turned into applause, would stay with him forever. He had played with his eyes closed, not because he was afraid, but because he finally understood. Real music doesn't need sight. It needs soul. And that day, every person in that grand hall had felt it. The power of a man who had nothing but heart, and the courage to share it with the world. The sound of clapping still echoed in his mind long after everyone had gone home. That night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of people who had once ignored him, now standing and applauding. For years he had been invisible, just another worker who swept the floors. But now the same hall that once made him feel small had turned into a place where his soul had finally spoken. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The faint sound of the city came through the window, cars passing, people talking in the distance. His hands still tingled from playing the piano earlier that day. It didn't feel real. He whispered softly, "Did this really happen?" The next morning he arrived early as usual. His uniform was clean, his shoes polished. Even though the conductor had told him to come not as a cleaner, old habits were hard to break. He still carried his mop, unsure whether the invitation was real or just kindness spoken in a heated moment. When he entered the hall, a few musicians were already there. They looked up and smiled warmly this time. "Morning," one said. Another nodded, saying, "We're glad you're here." Their tone had changed completely. No mockery, no pity. It was respect. He smiled shyly and nodded back. The conductor arrived a few minutes later, carrying his music sheets. The hall went silent. The cleaner instinctively lowered his head, but the conductor called out, "You, come here." The young man stepped forward nervously. The conductor's voice softened. "You're not working today. Sit at the piano. We'll rehearse something together." The musicians looked at each other, surprised. The cleaner hesitated. "Sir, I'm not sure if—" The conductor interrupted gently. "Trust me." He sat down at the piano once more. This time he wasn't trembling. The first few notes came quietly, and the orchestra followed. The sound that filled the hall was unlike anything they had ever played before. It wasn't perfect. A few notes stumbled here and there, but it was honest, alive, full of emotion. As they finished, the conductor nodded slowly. "You play from your heart. That's rare." From that day forward, the hall didn't feel like just a place of work anymore. It felt like home. Every afternoon when rehearsals ended, the conductor allowed him to stay and practice. Sometimes a few musicians stayed behind to listen, amazed by how much feeling he poured into every melody. Word spread quickly. People outside the orchestra wanted to see him play live. 1 week later, the conductor made an announcement. "For our next concert," he said, "we will have a guest performer." The musicians looked around curiously until his eyes rested on the cleaner. "He will perform with us." The room went silent for a moment, then filled with soft murmurs. Some were thrilled. Others were doubtful. A few thought it was risky to let someone without formal training play on such a big stage. But the conductor's decision was final. When the young man heard this, his chest tightened. "Sir, I don't deserve that," he said quietly. "I've never played for an audience. I might make mistakes." The conductor smiled faintly. "Every musician makes mistakes. What matters is whether the music comes from truth, and yours does." That night he practiced longer than he ever had. The janitor's closet, where he usually kept his cleaning tools, now held sheet music and a small notebook where he scribbled melodies. He stayed late, sometimes past midnight, playing under the soft stage lights until his hands hurt. But every note he played carried love, memory, and gratitude. The concert day arrived quickly. The grand hall looked different that evening. The chandeliers sparkled, the red velvet seats were filled with people dressed in their finest clothes, and a quiet buzz of excitement filled the air. Reporters were present too, eager to witness the performance that everyone had been talking about online. Backstage, the cleaner-turned pianist stood nervously, his heart racing. His uniform had been replaced with a simple black suit, borrowed from one of the violinists who insisted he wear it. He looked at his reflection in the mirror and hardly recognized himself. "I'm not the same man I was a week ago," he thought. The conductor approached him quietly. "You'll do fine," he said. "Remember, just play. Don't think about them. Close your eyes and play like you did that night." He nodded. The lights dimmed. The audience fell silent. The conductor walked to the podium, bowed slightly, and lifted his baton. The orchestra began softly, a gentle swell of strings filling the air. Then, at the right moment, the conductor turned to him and nodded. He took a deep breath and placed his fingers on the piano. The first note echoed through the hall like a drop of water in still air. The audience leaned forward. Slowly, he lost himself in the music. He played with closed eyes, letting the sound guide him. The melody rose, warm and full, blending with the orchestra's rhythm. Every note told a story. The years of silence, the pain of being ignored, the memory of his mother's soft hands guiding his little fingers across broken keys. Halfway through the piece, something magical happened. The hall, filled with hundreds of people, felt completely still. No one coughed, no one moved. They were caught in the spell of his music. It was as if time itself had stopped to listen. When the final note came, it lingered, long and trembling, before fading away. Then came silence. A silence so deep it felt sacred. For a few long seconds, no one clapped. They were too moved to react. The young man opened his eyes slowly, unsure if he had done well or made a fool of himself. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it echo in his ears. Then suddenly a single person stood and clapped. Then another. And another. Within moments, the entire hall was on its feet, applauding loudly. Some people were crying. Others were cheering. Cameras flashed. The sound of applause rolled through the hall like thunder. He stood there, frozen, tears welling up in his eyes. The conductor turned to him with a smile. Not the proud, distant one he usually wore, but a gentle, sincere smile. He walked over, took the young man's hand and raised it high in the air. The audience roared even louder. The musicians cheered behind them, smiling proudly. For the first time, he wasn't the cleaner who worked quietly in the background. He was the man whose music had touched hundreds of hearts at once. After the concert, people rushed backstage to meet him. Journalists wanted to interview him, photographers wanted his picture, and the musicians hugged him one by one. He felt overwhelmed. Someone asked him, "How did you learn to play like that?" He smiled softly and said, "By listening, not just to music but to life." That night, when the hall was empty again, he sat at the piano one last time. The lights were off except for a small lamp that glowed warmly above the keys. He touched the piano gently, smiling. The conductor came in quietly and stood beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, the conductor said, "I was wrong about you. I thought greatness only came from training and rules. But you reminded me why music exists in the first place." The young man looked up. "It's not about skill," he said softly. "It's about what you feel." The conductor nodded. "Exactly." They shared a quiet smile. Then the conductor placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've given this hall something it's been missing for years. Soul." As the conductor walked away, the young man stayed for a while, playing one last simple tune. It wasn't grand or loud, just a gentle melody that drifted softly through the empty hall, like a thank you whispered into the air. He knew this wasn't the end of his journey. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what came next. He had found his place not because someone gave it to him, but because he earned it with truth, pain, and love. When he finally stood up to leave, he looked back at the piano one more time and whispered, "Thank you." As he stepped out into the cool night, the world outside was quiet, but inside him, the music was still playing, and it always would. Weeks passed since that unforgettable concert, yet the memory of that night lingered like a melody that refused to fade. The young man's life had quietly changed, though he didn't fully realize how deeply. Each morning when he walked through the grand hall, people greeted him differently now. The security guard, who once barely looked at him, now smiled warmly. The stage crew waved at him, calling out his name. Even the conductor, once distant and strict, treated him like a fellow musician. But deep down, the young man was still humble. He didn't let the sudden attention change his heart. He still arrived early, still helped others carry instruments, and still treated the janitors and stagehands like family. To him, kindness mattered more than applause. The orchestra's next season was about to begin, and this time the conductor wanted him to play in more than one concert. "You belong on this stage," he said during a rehearsal break. The audience didn't just see talent in you, they felt something true. That's what music should do. Hearing those words filled the young man with both joy and fear. "What if I disappoint them next time?" he asked quietly. The conductor smiled. "The only way to disappoint anyone," he said, "is to stop being honest in your playing." Every evening, when everyone else went home, the young man stayed behind to practice. The sound of the piano echoed in the empty hall, soft and pure. Sometimes he played the same melody again and again until it felt like breathing. Other times he closed his eyes and simply improvised, letting memories guide his fingers. The janitors passing by would often stop for a moment, listening quietly before returning to their work. One night, as he was playing alone, he heard footsteps behind him. It was the conductor again. He stood quietly for a while, listening. Then he said, "You play differently when no one's watching." The young man smiled faintly. "When I play for people, I feel nervous. When I play alone, I just feel free." The conductor nodded. "That freedom, that's what people come to hear. Promise me you won't lose that." He promised. Soon, word of his story spread beyond the city. A journalist had written an article titled "From Cleaner to Concert Pianist." The story went viral. People around the world were touched by his journey. The boy who cleaned floors by day but played like a master by night. Invitations began arriving from other cities. Concert halls wanted him. Universities wanted him to speak to their students. But he didn't rush. He told the conductor he wanted to stay and learn more. "I still have a lot to understand about music," he said. Months went by. The orchestra's performances grew more emotional, more alive. The audience felt it too. It wasn't just about technical perfection anymore. It was about something deeper. The young man's sincerity had changed the atmosphere of the entire group. But fame, even gentle fame, brings new challenges. Some people began whispering behind his back. Old musicians who felt jealous, others who thought he didn't deserve his place because he had no formal education. One day he overheard two men saying, "He's just lucky. This won't last long." That night he went home quietly, the words echoing in his mind. Doubt crept in again. He wondered if they were right, if this was all temporary, if one day people would forget him. The next morning, the conductor noticed his silence. "What's wrong?" he asked. The young man hesitated but finally said, "Some people think I don't belong here. Maybe they're right." The conductor looked at him for a long time before replying softly, "You didn't take anyone's place. You created your own. Don't let anyone steal your peace." The words stayed with him. He realized that what made his music special wasn't training or recognition. It was honesty, emotion, and heart. So he played again that night, not to prove anyone wrong, but to remind himself who he was. Weeks later, the orchestra received an invitation to perform at an international festival, one of the most prestigious in Europe. The conductor turned to the young man. "You'll be our soloist," he said firmly. The young man's hands trembled. "Me? But there will be great artists there. I'm not—" The conductor interrupted with a smile. "You are exactly who you need to be." The festival was held in a grand, historic theater filled with the world's best musicians. On the night of the performance, the air buzzed with excitement. Backstage, he could hear the murmur of thousands of people waiting. He sat alone for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, breathing deeply. He thought about his mother, how she had once found an old piano in a neighbor's house and taught him to play using broken keys. He thought about all the years he spent sweeping floors and cleaning halls, dreaming quietly but never daring to believe it would come true. Tears filled his eyes, but he smiled. "This is for her," he whispered. When his turn came, he walked onto the stage slowly. The hall was massive, the lights blinding. For a moment he felt small again, but then he looked at the piano, and it felt like seeing an old friend. He sat down, closed his eyes, and began to play. The melody started softly, almost like a whisper. Then it grew stronger, richer, deeper. The orchestra followed, their sound weaving around his like waves. The audience leaned in, silent and captivated. His fingers moved with grace and emotion, as if the piano itself were breathing. Halfway through, something incredible happened. A gust of inspiration came over him and he began to improvise, not following the sheet music but his heart. The conductor saw it and didn't stop him. Instead, he guided the orchestra to follow. The result was magic. The melody soared through the hall like wind, filling every corner. The audience was stunned. It wasn't just music. It was a story told through sound, full of joy, pain, and hope. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was heavy and powerful. And then, once again, applause thundered through the hall. People rose to their feet, cheering wildly. Some shouted his name. He stood, bowing deeply, tears in his eyes. The conductor walked up beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and whispered, "You didn't just play tonight. You reminded them what real music feels like." After the performance, people rushed to meet him. Reporters asked endless questions. Promoters offered him tours. A famous pianist approached him and said, "You play with something none of us can learn, a pure heart." But even with all the praise, he remained humble. "I'm just grateful," he said softly. "The piano saved me. It gave me a voice when I had none." Months later, he began teaching children from poor neighborhoods how to play. He didn't charge them. He said music should never be locked behind money or privilege. Every Saturday, he gathered them in a small hall, teaching them simple melodies and encouraging them to play with feeling. "Don't try to impress anyone," he told them. "Just let your heart speak." The conductor sometimes visited those lessons quietly, standing at the back and watching with pride. He saw the same spark in those children's eyes that he once saw in the cleaners, the hunger to express, to be seen, to be free. Years later, when people spoke of the young man, they didn't just call him a pianist. They called him the soul of the hall. His music had become more than sound. It was a bridge between worlds, between rich and poor, between silence and voice. And though many concerts came after that, though he traveled to many countries and played before presidents and kings, his heart never changed. He always remembered where he came from, the broom in his hands, the echo of empty halls the night he was told, "Don't touch that piano." Every time he sat to play, he closed his eyes, smiled softly, and remembered that first moment, when he dared to touch the keys anyway. And as his fingers danced once more across the piano, it was as if the world held its breath. waiting to hear what truth sounded like when played by someone who had nothing but love to give.